All right, so we're now moving on to the next part of this unit, and that's going to be section 5b. And we're going to be focusing on now solving proportions, but also now you're going to be given some word problems, and you're going to have to now create your proportion and then solve. All right, we're going to break this down into two different videos. And the first video is we're just going to focus on solving proportions. And for most of you, this is nothing that's new because we did this last year in detail. And then the second part or the second video is going to be translating word problems into proportions and then solving them as well. All right, so there's two different videos. One is just going to focus solely on solving proportions, and then the second one is going to then give us some word problems and go through how we can set them up and how we can solve. I didn't want to do it in one video in case it got a little bit longer. This way we can break them down into two smaller, easier to manage videos. All right, so you might be given this problem here. It says solve for x. And first off, it doesn't need to tell us that they're a proportion in the directions because we know that a proportion is when two ratios are equal to each other. And we can represent a ratio as a fraction. So this here, even though it doesn't flat out tell us, is giving us two fractions that are equal to each other. So they are two ratios that are equal, which means we can say that they are proportional. All right, so that's how we know. Without even the directions, we know that they're proportional because the two ratios are equal, the two fractions are equal. And one of the things that we talked about in the other video was we went through multiple ways for how we can determine if two ratios are in fact proportional to each other. And one way that we discussed was if I gave you the fraction 1/2, and we know that this is proportional or that these fractions are equal, 3/6, is we talked about we can do what's called cross multiply. We can do 1 times 6, which is giving me the 6, and then we can say 2 times 3, which is also 6, and we know that they're going to be equal. So using that logic, we can use that to solve for x here because since they tell us that they're equal, they flat out tell us by giving us that equal sign, we can then do our cross multiplying. We can say 4 times x because we can do the one numerator times the other denominator, and the other numerator times the other denominator is equal to 6 times 9. Since they're telling us that they're proportional and we're not proving it like we were in this example here, we can go ahead and set them equal. And by doing this and cross multiplying, it gives us 4x is now equal to 54. And it just gives us a regular equation, one-step equation that we know how to solve now. Because if I say 4 times some number is equal to 54, well, how do I solve for that number? I need to divide each side by 4. And that means x is then going to give me 54 divided by 4. We can write it as a reduced fraction, so we can divide both of these by 2 if we wanted to. And we can get 27 over 2. You can write it as a mixed fraction if you wanted to, as 13 1/2. Or if you wanted to, you can write that as a decimal as well as 13.5. Or if you wanted to go straight into it, you could just go ahead and divide them and say, well, 4 goes into 5 once. So we can subtract. That gives me 1. I'll bring down the other 4. 4 goes into 14 3 times. So we can subtract. That gives me 2. So now I can go ahead and add that decimal. So I can bring down to 0, and 4 goes into 25 times. So you can just go straight into the division. You can reduce your fraction, leave it as a fraction, or you can write it as an improper fraction or a mixed fraction. Either one will be acceptable for me. I'm not going to force you to do any one way or the other. All right. So that's solving a proportion. All right. That is a basic proportion. We're going to go through just one more example of solving a proportion in this video where it could be maybe just slightly harder. All right, so let's go ahead and go through one other example before we end this video and then move on to our next video. All right, so the last question that we had was just a very basic x as our numerator or denominator. And there was nothing else being done to the x. So this type of problem now, we had to be able to solve as well, where now it's not just a variable d, but it's d minus 2. So it looks like it's a little bit harder, but we follow the same steps. Once I see it's a proportion, because it's two fractions that are equal to each other, I can go ahead and cross multiply. So I can multiply the one numerator with the other denominator. Now, you're always going to see me write it like this. I'm not going to jump straight to the multiplication. I'm going to write it in parentheses like that. And the reason is because of this next one. So we know it's going to be equal to, and now I'm going to do the other denominator multiplied by the other numerator. So 2 times d minus 2. If I don't put it in parentheses, I might forget that I have to distribute that 2 to both the d and that minus 2, and I might just multiply that d. So it's important that you write it out like this first because it's making sure that you're not going to make any simple mistakes. All right, now we can go ahead and simplify. We can do 4 times 5, which is 20. And we're going to distribute that just like we did in our other problems. This is nothing new. 2 times d gives me 2d, and 2 times negative 2 gives me minus 4. And now we can go ahead and solve. Well, I'll get rid of the minus 4 by adding. So 24 is equal to 2d. And then I can go ahead and divide both sides by 2 to figure out that d is then equal to 12. And if I wanted to check my work, I can plug it back in. Well, 12 minus 2 is over top of 4 is equal to 10 over 4, which will then reduce to 5 over 2, meaning that I know I did the right work. Right, so those are just the different types of proportions that you might see, and how you would solve them is through cross multiplying. All right, when we get to our next video, which is going to be some word problems, I'll go through maybe some other methods that you can use if you wanted to, as opposed to having to do this cross multiplication. All right, so that is it for this video.